cis people are performing gender as much or more than trans people, right?
Yes.
The beauty industry, like
Mhm.
what work people are putting into. I mean, there are women who put 2 hours a day into hair and makeup, literally. And I think so much, and they're, what they would say about that, because I had a conversation with someone close to me about this once who was doing that.
Mhm.
She was like, it feels like self-care. I feel like I'm, this time is for me. It gives me this kind of chance to connect with myself, and it feels like meditative. And I think all that can be true for the individual person, and still at the societal level, like obviously we're being sold a bunch of products that are landing in the ocean, right? Like it's
Mhm.
it's not for us or about us
Mm.
ultimately.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, neurodivergence, disability, kink, mental health, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you appreciate this podcast and want to support us, visit our website 50shadesofgender.com, as in FIFTY, to make a donation, find out more about our allyship course and workshops, and details of how to join our community. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Mattia Maurée, a composer, writer, AuDHD coach, and founder and host of the podcasts The Longer Road and AuDHD Flourishing. Mattia's pronouns are they and them, and they are non-binary trans, agender, genderqueer, transmasc, autigender, AuDHD, and queer, as well as neuroqueer. They also use the labels relationship anarchy and poly. Find out what that means to Mattia in this episode. We also talk about being taken seriously when you're outside the gender binary, what counts as an apology and what doesn't, assumptions about presentation, the importance of diverse transition stories, performing gender, how advice for different neurotypes can be conflicting, and navigating intersectional marginalised identities. Please be aware that there is brief mention of sexual assault statistics in this episode. It was recorded on the 21st of July 2023. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Mattia Maurée.
Hi, Mattia. So you've given me quite a cocktail of labels. So there's non-binary trans, there's agender, we have genderqueer, transmasc, autigender, which is one I find really interesting, AuDHD, and then you've also given me relationship, anarchy, poly, and queer. So that's a lot to talk about. So I don't even know if we're going to get to all of them. But I was thinking, let's just start at the beginning. So non-binary trans, what does it mean to you to be non-binary trans?
Yeah, so for me, the trans umbrella includes non-binary and genderqueer and a lot of these other labels. So
Mm-hmm.
trans is sort of the larger label of my felt gender not aligning with what I was assigned at birth. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to do any particular acts of transitioning in order to be trans, but a lot of people do. And so that's partly why, like for example, the label transmasc, I have, medically transitioned. So that's part of, my journey. And so then non-binary is just being outside of the male female binary, which many, many people are. Again, just naturally, there are so many variations in physical gender. And I've seen a variety of numbers between like 16 and 30 that would actually be the biological genders if we were to actually use biological markers for gender. So way, way more than two. So
Yeah.
that's, all the variations that can happen between the connection between your chromosomes, your hormones, your secondary and primary sex characteristics, like just the things that can happen in the development of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are outside the binary, whether they think they are or not, because they don't actually know what all of their gender markers are.
Yeah.
But I specifically don't align with male or female. So that's why, non-binary is just kind of like, well, I am not that.
Mm-hmm.
And Yeah, that's usually the term I use the most. If I were to kind of choose one term, interestingly, I actually think agender is the one that feels the most aligned, but I feel like non-binary is something that a lot more people are aware of and know what it is. So if I pick a term, I will usually say non-binary or sometimes just trans.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So you mentioned a bit about transitioning. So you also mentioned that you have still a certain amount of conflict around feeling largely agender, but having pursued like physical transition. So yeah, what does transition look like for you and how does it conflict? Is it more of a societal thing or an internal thing or both?
So the thing that I thought about the most with that was when I was having top surgery, when I had a double mastectomy, intentionally as an elective surgery. That was the one that I was like, I know that I'm doing this. It's in part there was I don't know, maybe 20% sensory issues because I'm also autistic. So,
Hmm.
there was sweat and bouncing and discomfort, that I also didn't want. So, there was a little bit of that, but I would say most of it was knowing how people treated me
Mm.
and knowing that no matter how I dressed, if I was not binding, if I wasn't wearing a binder, people always read me as a lesbian and not as, non-binary or sort of other gender. And funnily enough, now, I don't know, 6 years later, since I started transitioning, I don't mind that as much. So I feel a lot more flexible with how people treat me, but my body also aligns with how I think of myself. Like when I look in the mirror, my body makes sense to me. And I think that
Interesting.
that has helped me, kind of not care. Because if people are perceiving me in a particular way, I'm kind of like, well, I did everything I could. I kind of, I held
Mhm.
up my end of the bargain, and now it's up to you to, actually see me correctly.
Yeah, yeah. Because another thing you mentioned was about being taken seriously as non-binary if you don't look like androgynous or if you don't
Hmm.
aim for looking androgynous, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I know a lot of, femme non-binary people who are presenting more femme or, wearing quote women's clothing, or have a curvy body,
Mhm.
who talk about this all the time. And at the same time, it's kind of a talking point, but it hasn't really sunk into the, mainstream yet. Even like I was visiting my sibling who is gender fluid and uses they them pronouns, and they have a roommate who they've been living with for 2 years who misgendered them right in front of me, and I corrected them, but afterwards my sibling was like, yeah, they misgender me all the time. I'm like,
Oh gosh.
how is that?
That's
That's
not,
so rude.
yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if you live with someone.
Yeah.
Wow. It's like surely you've come across this before. It's not
Yeah.
like it's a new thing that you have to get
Spoiler
used to.
alert, he's a white man.
Oh, okay then.
And he's just not making an effort. But yeah, I was pretty struck by that. I was like, oh right, this was my experience,
Mhm.
pre certainly like top surgery I feel like made the most difference.
Yeah, that comes actually something comes to mind when you said that, or something came to mind when you said that, which is like how exhausting it must be to keep having to correct people. And at one point, I can imagine you just give up. With some people, you just give up. It sounds like what your sibling might have done with their roommate. You know.
I think so. Yeah. And I mean,
Mm,
I think one place that was hard for me that I would give up pretty easily in was the workplace. If I had coworkers who, I was correcting repeatedly, I actually had one situation where someone ended up almost getting fired because of the way they were treating me, the way she was treating me
mm,
in the work. She was a explicitly outspokenly conservative person in a fairly liberal workplace.
mm,
And at one point, I mean, she had misgendered me, and I just said something, and she responded with something like, basically, I don't have to do that.
mm, mm,
And when I followed up, it ended up getting escalated to HR, and they kind of just stepped in. They were like, don't try to handle this. Like, we will handle this. And they
mm.
made her do, I think, sensitivity training or something.
Right.
Um,
And yes, you do
which-
have to do that,
right.
actually. Yeah.
And she just didn't speak to me for the rest of the time I was there. She actually reached out on Facebook years later to with like a weird kind of non-apology, and I just didn't respond, because once you
Mm.
like respond to someone's message, they can see that there's like an
Yeah.
open interaction, and I was just like, nope, I am
How about no?
not
Yeah.
interested. But if it
Yeah.
was a real apology, maybe, but it really wasn't. It was just like a weird
Interesting.
thing. So
Yeah.
it sticks in other people's minds too, I think, when they mess up.
Yeah. That
Like
makes
I've had
sense.
that experience before where people, apologize repeatedly, or they get really intense about apologizing. And for me personally, I mean, every trans person's different, but for me personally, what I prefer is just that people just say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and just kind of move on and
Hmm.
don't make a big deal about it. I don't
Yeah.
need a bunch of follow-up emails or like,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I sort of try and do. To be honest, I don't often get it wrong, but when I do feel really like, oh God, but that's my problem to deal with, not the other person's. So I do try and
Exactly.
be like, okay, moving on. And even some of my non-binary and trans friends get each other's pronouns. It just happens.
Yep.
Yeah. One thing you just said was about an apology versus a non-apology. Could you give an example of like what is an apology? What is an actual apology? And what was that non-apology that you received and made you go, no thanks?
Yeah.
You know?
I don't remember exactly what she said, so I'm gonna make up an example. But
Yeah, that's fine.
in misgendering, so
Mm.
actually, I had somebody misgender me on a public social media post, and I just did like a asterisk they, uh, and they this person replied and just said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I do think of you as they," and I usually say that. That was just like a total brain blip. And they also followed up and sent me a message and said the same, just kind of reiterated that. So
Hmm.
that was like, plenty. That was,
That's
very,
an apology.
very much enough.
Hmm. Yeah.
And a non apology is, I mean, for example, I hear people say, like, "Oh, this is so hard for me to remember." Like, "Oh, I'm trying," stuff like that, where it's like, it makes it about them
Yeah.
and their experience and not
Yeah, and
about,
excuses really, isn't it?
yeah,
Like if you've made a mistake, own up to that mistake and don't be like, well, it was kind of a mistake, but also it's not my fault and blah, 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 all
yeah,
that shit. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And I
Yeah.
think that happens a lot. I mean, I have friends with neo pronouns,
Hmm.
like other, so there's, he, she, they, and then there's Zer, and he,
Yeah.
there's all these other ones basically.
Yeah.
And some of which actually, even though they're under the neo pronouns umbrella, are actually older. Like there are some of these pronouns have actually been around for a long time,
Hmm.
but it's a lot harder to get people to use those pronouns, especially spoken. I feel like if you're writing, people can kind of like take the time and figure it
Hmm.
out in an email or something. But spoken, I found people really have trouble with those because they've usually never used that exact one before.
Yeah. Do you feel
And
like that's a grammatical thing?
I mean, it can be because I think, it's the same setup as any other pronoun where there's, different forms and you're trying to use the right one for the right moment. But I
Hmm.
also think it's just people not having that in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
So I know people with neopronouns who've used neopronouns because it feels like the best thing for them. And then they've just gone back to they because there's like, people can remember they.
Hmm.
And I think that's, that's like a little sad thing that a lot of people aren't using the pronouns they would want to use because society just like cannot handle it
Yeah.
consistently. And then you're in that. And I remember this when I was trying to get people to use my pronouns, early on, just being so frustrated, like you said, about having to correct people over and over. And I would get really upset about it if it would happen, a bunch of times in the same, social setting. I
Hmm.
remember one time in particular getting really upset and following up with the host of this gathering I'd been at. And hilariously later, this person ended up being trans and coming out.
Wow.
But this is
Interesting.
it. They weren't out yet and they didn't know yet. So
Yeah.
this was, I was the first non-binary person they knew. And they were repeatedly misgendering me. And I followed up to just be like, that felt really, really shitty. I went home and cried. Like I felt really
Oh,
bad. And
yeah.
then, I don't know, a year or two later they came out as trans and I was like, okay. So
Wow, that's so interesting. Like I have some friends who like, some queer friends who are like they use self-created names, so they're unconventional. And I can imagine it being like if you have to correct people about your name all the time. Usually I find that doesn't happen as much as with pronouns because if you're like if you introduce someone or they introduce themselves and then someone repeats it back to them and they get it slightly wrong, they're like, no, actually it's this, and then they catch up eventually. They get it, they have it. It still sometimes goes wrong, but it's like it feels so different from because pronouns, people are just like, how many times do I have to do this? It feels like that, really. Yeah.
totally. And we
Yeah.
have more of a social understanding around names that it is rude to mispronounce someone's name.
Hmm.
Like that's just a convention,
Yeah.
at least in the culture I'm in, that's, you don't do that if possible. You try to get their name right.
Hmm.
And, that after you've spent some time with someone that you should know their name. I actually had a friend who's bi, whose partner is straight, and she either could not or would not remember and pronounce correctly my name, and always misgendered me. And I was like, look, I don't have a problem with her, but if she can't remember my name or my pronouns, like, we're not friends.
Right.
that's not
Yeah.
that's not any kind
Not
of real
okay.
relationship. It's just, she's on the other side of you, my actual friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that stood out because I was so struck that she like would not. And again, I don't want to say would not, right? It's possible she just could not, and we didn't hang out that much, so who knows? But I remember
Mm.
just like every time she would mispronounce my name, I was just like, okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm. Yeah. Gosh, what an uphill battle to really struggle with, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
people mispronounce my name all the time, I should say, just because it's not an American. It's actually an Italian name, and it's
Ah.
not one that people are used to. And I don't pronounce it in the Italian way, right? I don't say it like with an Italian accent or anything, but
Ah, so would the stress be on, is it Mattia? Would that be the Italian version?
I think so.
So
Yeah,
you've
it's
got the
like
stress on the
Matthew.
I, like
hmm
Mattia. Is that
hmm
what you do?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then I don't do,
Yeah.
in Italian, you really emphasize those double consonants as well. Like
Ah,
they
okay.
have an extra. You hold them for a second.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a language nerd, so I do enjoy all of that stuff. But yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So thinking about moving on to the next label, or is there
hmm
anything else you wanted to talk about being agender?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's just it's a total lack, right? So
Mm-hmm.
non-binary could mean for a lot of people who are non-binary or like genderqueer in particular. I think a lot of people who are genderqueer feel like they're sort of, in the middle or sort of have some masculine, some feminine, however they would describe that. And I just feel like I have an almost complete lack of gender interest in gender. I just don't care. And I think leaning into that label and that understanding has actually helped me care less when people do misgender me. Or my absolute favorite now is when old men in the street are confused by what is happening here and are like looking me up and down, trying to like figure out what's happening. They usually don't engage, which is nice. I mean, I have, the protection of being white, and, I don't typically get harassed in a way that, say, like a black trans woman does all the time. So I have that space where it's like, it's humorous to me when people are having that interaction with me outside because they usually don't bother me or do anything. I'm not like afraid for my life.
Well, that's a bonus then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking to Tash, which is my previous podcast guest, about like, everyday misogyny and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just it's a lot to put up with that's been normalized, and I almost feel like gender diversity and the way it's becoming more, I wouldn't say mainstream, but kind of mainstream, I suppose. Um, yeah, I feel like that's almost putting a spotlight on that, and I can see almost the way that people respond to trans people as a real, like, spotlight on this internalized misogyny that we all have. I mean, internalized misogyny is obviously only one aspect of it. There's the internalized homophobia and transphobia and all that other stuff too.
And actually, the spotlight thing is a really good point because what that first made me think of, what I thought you were saying was that more people are aware of transness and what trans people look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're getting clocked more, like being people knowing that we're trans.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting when I've been in spaces like when I traveled to Knoxville in Tennessee recently, which is like the middle of kind of the what I think of as like the deep South in America, even though it's not as far south. It's just, but it's part of that culture.
Mm-hmm.
If I dress mask, nobody questions me. People call me he, him. That's
Mm-hmm.
if you're not super aware of what a trans person looks like and you're used to just putting people into the binary,
Mm-hmm.
people don't get seen as much as trans. And for some people, that's a really lovely experience. If you're wanting to pass and that's like an important part of your identity,
Mm-hmm.
I think that can feel really good. And then there's a different experience of being seen and accepted for not only your gender presentation, but also your journey, I guess, of being trans.
Yeah, it must be tricky because, like you say, people tend to revert to the binary, which can be a good thing, but then, like, they wouldn't have a clue about who you actually are.
Yeah. And I have the exact same thought when I see someone who is visibly trans. And if I think that they are wanting to pass, trying to figure out, how to interact with them, and I just ask, right? I ask, people what their pronouns are, but, that I do like, I want trans women to feel like seen and beautiful, right? So for me to, but then there are also lots of, trans women who are also non-binary. So, there's this, and they might say trans woman, but then they're also non-binary. So a lot of people have these like interesting, which I'm sure you've heard, overlapping labels where at first glance you're like, oh, I don't know if that makes sense. And then you're like, oh, nope, that's your experience. These are the labels that work for you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's such a good point, because we all make so many assumptions about other people, don't we? And like, the desire to really want to affirm people in their identity. I mean, we all make assumptions as well. Like you just said, like, oh, is this person could be perceived as a trans woman, but doesn't mean that she's or they are a binary trans person.
Exactly.
Yeah, they could just be a queer. I don't know. Even like so many, it could be so many things that they could be. So, yeah, talking about genderqueer a little bit, how does that fit together for you? What does it mean to you to be genderqueer?
So that was the first label I used. So I've kind of hung on to it, even though I don't tend to use it that much anymore. I started, well, I was talking about gender from the time I was at least 10 years old, but nobody around me had any idea what I was talking about. I grew up super religious and conservative, like evangelical American, this, anti-vaxxer, like the whole really far on one side of the spectrum. And I kept saying things like, I think I have a boy brain, or like things like that. And I talked about gender and I was trying to like deconstruct gender a bit. But every time I said something like that, I just got blank stares. Like I didn't even really get people arguing with me. There was just sort of a like, what are you
Does
talking
not
about?
compute.
Yeah,
Right?
does not compute, just absolutely nothing. So I feel like even if people have been arguing with me, it might have sent me down that road faster. But I just got no response. And I was just like, okay, I guess I'm just, talking nonsense then. Like I just had no concept. And then in college, I knew some binary trans people. And I remember thinking with both like my two friends who I was closer with who were trans and being like, well, I'm not like the trans man experience like appeals to me a lot. And there's a lot about this that sounds really interesting and lovely. The trans woman experience, doesn't sound like my experience, but I get what she's talking about. So I was hearing these things and I was just like, yeah, that's not quite it. But I was talking to my partner at that time. So when I was like 18, I was talking to my partner about gender and that I felt trans. So I was using the word trans. But again, because I was like, I'm not a trans man, and that was the only thing I knew you could do, I was just like, yeah, I guess not. And so then I came out as a lesbian and then soon came out again as bi because what was happening was that my gender and my sexuality were getting all mixed up. I was like, a lot of the feelings I was ascribing to sexuality were actually gender and wanting to, be non-binary and be perceived as non-binary and wanting to date only queer people. So not wanting to date, say, straight men. And I was like, okay, if I don't want to date straight men and I love women and I must be a woman because what else could I possibly be? I guess I'm a lesbian. Anyway, so there's this very roundabout thing where if I had even heard of the term genderqueer or non-binary, any of that, like I would have known that that's what I was from, I think, a pretty young age. And I think I met my first genderqueer person when I was 22. That sounds right. And didn't immediately, I mean, it wasn't just like, oh my God, that's me immediately, but it was a pretty quick process of like, oh, that would explain a lot. And then the term genderqueer, I was like, okay, I love genderqueer because it again, it lets me, express myself or present myself however I want to, but it doesn't require anything of me, right? Whereas I perceive trans as kind of requiring transition in some form, even if it's just coming out, And then in 2015, I took there's an American survey for trans people that's used for, and they do it like, I think every 5 years or so, but it's a bunch of data. And I was going to take the survey, but I was still in that, like, I'm not sure if I'm trans enough. And the very beginning of the survey had a little blurb that was like, here are the things that are under the trans umbrella. And basically, if you consider yourself to be one of these for the purpose of this quiz, or survey, you are trans enough. And I just started crying. Like when I
Oh,
read that, I was like, oh,
yeah.
and yeah, so I actually started coming out as genderqueer after that and started
Mm.
kind of exploring other terms. So yeah, that summer I started coming out, but that was, yeah, genderqueer was the first label that I was like, this makes sense to me. This doesn't make me change anything automatically. I can just tell people this.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what I found was that simply telling people that and asking them to start using they, them pronouns did not do enough. Some
Mm.
people did, and really made an effort, but it was as soon as I started wearing more men's clothes and started binding, I was like, oh, people are actually seeing me and taking me seriously
Mm.
when I make a physical change as opposed to just giving people a new label.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to provide evidence, don't you?
Yes.
Like you
It
said
does feel
about
like
you
that.
talked about the androgynous look. If you don't look
Yep.
androgynous enough, or like more between androgynous and the opposite sex almost,
Right.
or even the words opposite sex make me
Right.
cringe a little bit, but okay. Yeah, yeah. I like the idea of that survey that you talked about. It reminded me a bit of the gender census. There's a person called Cassian who runs the UK one, and they do it every year. I've had them as a guest on the podcast a while ago, and just some of the stuff that we discussed was just mind blowing. It was so interesting, and the stuff they learned as well. It's like, wow, yeah. Anyway, transmasc, you did touch on that, but I don't know if you have any more that you wanted to explore in that on that label.
Yeah. So the probably the biggest thing for me that's made the most difference besides top surgery is I did low dose T for 5 years, and I actually am taking a break
Mm.
right now, which is something I haven't really, haven't talked about, wasn't really thinking of talking about. But since this is
Mhm.
about gender, I think it's nice for people to hear kind of like different stories of transition
Yeah.
because the medical model is you have a problem and we're going to treat it until you reach this point. I've
Yeah.
had the great good fortune of having, I actually have a trans doctor now, which is amazing, having a trans
Wow.
doctor.
That's
And
great.
then my previous doctor with whom I started T was an expert who like teaches other doctors on trans therapies.
Wow.
So I've only had great experiences with doctors in seeking hormones and everything. And even like when I first wanted to start, you have to get a letter. Or maybe this was for surgery, but I had to get a letter at some point from my psychiatrist. And I actually, at that time, had not talked to my psychiatrist very much other than pronoun update.
Hmm.
Um, and when I said it, he was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that I haven't asked. You've said some things that should have indicated, that this
Mm.
was happening." He was like, "I'm very happy to write a letter saying we've been talking about this for 2+ years," which I think was the requirement.
Wow.
And anyway, so but yeah, transmasc. The other thing, like being on T, the thing I was going to say that's like made the biggest difference for me is my voice lowering. So that was the thing that I
Ah.
wanted
Yeah.
the most. Funnily enough, I'm still mostly gendered as a woman on the phone, but my
Mm.
voice is almost an octave lower than it was. I had an extremely high, I was a high soprano,
Wow.
classically trained, operatic, big, big high
Wow.
voice. I could barely make sound below about middle C on the piano if you're, a music person. And my speaking voice was so I was speaking at the bottom of my range, which is bad for your singing voice. And it still sounded very, very high. And
Wow.
I have a podcast now or two podcasts now of my own. And
Mm.
I get the feedback all the time that people love my voice and find it comforting. And I
Hmm.
did not hear that a single time in my life before T. So,
Wow, that's so interesting, right?
yeah.
Do you also think it's partly to do with being taken more seriously if you have a lower voice? And I think I've been
Yeah.
guilty of that myself. Like when I've encountered this is years ago now. So since then, I have learned to, change my perspective on it. But also, like years ago, there was I think it was a friend's teenage daughter, and I just remember her talking, and her voice was just really quite high. And I was just a bit taken aback by it. It almost sounded like really girly. And, I had some inner judgments about it almost. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Side tangent. But yeah, like I think you do. Do you feel like you get taken more seriously maybe with if you have a lower voice?
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think you're spot on. There's a lot of that's that misogyny again,
Yep.
is, that women's ideas and concepts and ways of being and ways of presenting are less valid and less serious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
I have
'Cause
no feelings about that.
no, neither do I. None whatsoever. So, yeah, shall we get to autigender? So, yeah, obviously that's a combination of like the gender, I don't know, your perception of gender from the perspective of being autistic, isn't it? And like inextricably linked, that being inextricably linked. So, yeah, what does that mean to you? And how did you find the term, since when, or when did you embrace it? Yeah.
Yeah, I found the term pretty soon after I started exploring autism pretty soon after I came out as genderqueer. So that was a not exactly related, but sort of a similar time frame for me.
Mm.
And came across the term probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago in the community, in the autistic adult community. And as you said, it's just that combination. It's this idea that my gender is inextricably linked with my autism, which is, affects it's my whole brain, right? It's my entire experience of the world.
Mm.
And when it's been looked at, autistic people are 7 times more likely to be trans than non-autistic people. And there's one study where they tried to figure out what's going on. They were like, is it, like one of the theories was like, is it that the clothes are comfortable? Trying to just like wear more, right? Like they were like, what is it that makes people, autistic people more likely to be trans? Is it sensory
Mm.
stuff? And the conclusion of the study was being trans or being autistic does not make people trans. Being typically developing makes people cis because they care about the societal rules and labels. And autistic
Wow.
people just don't. So,
Interesting.
not every autistic person is gender expansive,
Hmm.
but autigender is sort of this again, it's like you might not be transitioning or doing anything in particular, but the way that you experience and feel and think about your gender is really linked with your view of just your concept of self in the world as an autistic
Mm.
person.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
definitely feel that, and I don't use that term a lot. Again, like if I'm picking a label or two to put in a bio or something, I
Hmm.
usually don't use that one unless I'm in an autistic specific space, and then I will, or like
Yeah.
a neurodivergent specific space.
That makes sense. Yeah, I feel like I've had a couple of 2 or 3 other conversations with autigender folks. I think 2 that have included it in the label, and a third that was still, or he was still discovering or exploring that side of things. So yeah, but it is interesting, isn't it? Because since like connecting with more gender expansive folks, I've started to question what gender means, and then I started questioning what gender means to me, and what does it mean to be a woman, and is that accurate? And I have no idea, and I still have no idea really. And it's such a construct, and it's just kind of beyond me. And also, I've been exploring and discovering my own neurodivergence. And also, like, hindsight, you're like, oh, now my life makes sense, like that. And it almost makes sense to me how they go together. Like how people who are neurodivergent are a bit like, Gender? What is this? Does not compute. Like, no thanks, you can have it back. Kind of that kind of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I love this idea too that cis people are performing gender as much or more than trans people, right?
Yes.
The beauty industry,
Mm.
like what work people are putting into. I mean, there are women who put 2 hours a day into hair and makeup, literally. And I think so much, and they're, what they would say about that, because I had a conversation with someone close to me about this once who was doing that.
Hmm.
She was like, it feels like self-care. I feel like I'm, this time is for me. It gives me this kind of chance to connect with myself, and it feels like meditative. And I think all that can be true for the individual person, and still at the societal level, like obviously we're being sold a bunch of products that are landing in the ocean, right? Like
Hmm.
it's not for us or about us
Mm.
ultimately. And people are taking that and making it, a practice that works for them. And I think about that a lot, that if like cis women in particular, because if they don't wear makeup, they make, I think, $1,000 less a year on average in the US.
Wow.
Um, so like, going into the
Mm.
workforce that you have to wear makeup if you want to make more money.
Hmm.
And not everybody does. And there are some cultures, like I grew up in Seattle, which is a culture of not wearing makeup. So that I was
Okay.
used to that.
Hmm.
But there's definitely this feeling that if you're a woman in America and you don't perform femininity correctly, that you will be harassed in bathrooms potentially if you look, too masculine. That
Hmm.
happens to queer friends of mine, right? You will make less money. I once didn't get a job and I was wearing a skirt, and this was, years ago, but I was wearing a skirt and not nylons. And they told me that was one of the reasons I didn't get the job. Now, that's probably illegal, technically.
Wow.
Obviously didn't want the job at that point. But I think about that sometimes too, that it's like, okay, these all of these things piling up on each other, like the cumulative effects over time of not getting that job, of not getting the raise, of making less,
Mm-hmm.
and how a lot of that is inextricably tied to, gender and race and
Yeah.
neurodivergence as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people dislike autistic people, non-autistic people dislike autistic people on site with, 2 seconds of interaction.
Yeah.
Until they find out that they're autistic, and then they're like, oh, okay, and then it's, fine. But like, I don't want to have to go around telling everybody that. And I'm
Yeah, it's like,
aware
but people
that,
make
yeah,
allowances almost, rather than
yeah,
be like, I think if they had initially just been more open, maybe, and just be like, not assuming that everyone's neurotypical.
yep,
And I think I've been there myself. I've been in situations where someone has responded to me and I found it rude and I was really annoyed, not expressing that to them necessarily or at all. That's not what I do. But like afterwards, I realized like, oh, they might have just been neurodivergent and they just couldn't. It's like, not they couldn't help themselves, because that sounds wrong, but also like, how do I want to express that? So I don't know, it's about making allowances or being open, isn't it? For people just being different. People are just different. And it's not like, I think maybe we jump to the conclusion, maybe this is stuff that went on for me internally. That was like, oh, this person doesn't like me and is judging me or is being rude to me because they, I don't know, I guess dislike maybe is a term. And then, yeah, so figuring out which stuff is like projection on this other person, rather than actually what they're about, because we don't know unless we have a conversation about that, really, do we?
yeah. And I think about that so much, right? Because we've got this pile of labels I gave you. I'm
Hmm.
not going to say that in a first conversation with someone, right?
Yeah,
I'm not going to list all those things.
yeah.
And at the same time, that pile of labels might be the best shorthand for understanding my experience at this time,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you
I
know?
wonder if we all introduced ourselves, no, it's a bit tricky, isn't it? Because like labels can be beneficial and they can also be the opposite. But like if we introduced ourselves with all these labels to do with just all these aspects of us, how people perceive us is definitely going to change. And I think it can, I don't know, it brings up our own stuff, basically, our own inner judgments, our own inner internalized societal crap, just all of it, really. Yeah. I feel like I'm quite a curious person and an open minded person. But, I also have my not just judgments, but like I tend to judge other things than most people judge, I suppose. But also, like, yeah, we all have this internalized stuff. And it's interesting to find that in yourself and then be willing to just sit down and unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Yeah. I mean,
internalized misogyny, especially.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I was going to say, I noticed those thoughts coming up in myself
Hmm.
for sure.
Yeah.
And, toward myself and other people.
Yeah.
That's where, a lot of the, trans people consistently have poor mental health
Hmm.
outcomes,
Hmm.
and I think it's pretty obvious that a lot of that is from trauma and being treated like shit in society.
Hmm.
And like,
Yeah.
at least in the US right now, all these laws being passed and, all these things like where we are explicitly not wanted
Yeah.
in a lot of spaces. And, I think, and actually autistic people as well, autistic people are more easily traumatized. And the numbers
Yeah.
I've seen are, trigger warning for mention of sexual assault, 90% of autistic women have been sexually assaulted.
Wow.
So, the numbers are pretty bad in terms of
Hmm.
autistic people, and like, bullying rates being very high, et cetera.
Yep.
And there's all these, bits of trauma that come along with some of these identities, especially if you've held them for a long time, or even if you haven't, right? You could have been not known that you were trans and autistic as a kid and still have
Hmm.
been bullied for it because people could tell you were
Yes.
different.
Yeah. That makes so
Yeah.
much sense because as I was at a human library event, I sometimes take part as a book in the human library. I don't know if you've heard of the human library, but it's like, it's about having a conversation with someone, like people as books with titles that reflect like stereotyping and stigma and all sorts of things. And I think my title that day was pansexual. I think it was pansexual. And I remember some of the kids, I mean, being in a school environment, that's a whole other trauma for me, because I noticed it, I found it very challenging and it was very stressful. And it's not something I need to do very often, that aside. But one of the kids, I remember asking me, saying, did you get bullied for being queer? Because I thought, oh, maybe just queer was my title. I can't quite remember. And that made me realize, like, no, I was too young to even have a clue about that. But I think, I mean, I was definitely bullied a lot, quite badly. And I think that had to do with being neurodivergent. And that was in a time where I had no idea what neurodivergent even was. The way autism was presented to the world, in a way, it was like this severe condition of people, like, being, what is even the term? I don't even know the terms right now. But it was
Nonverbal.
presented. I don't know if you can relate to that. If you
Yeah.
if looking back like a few decades now, about what autism was considered to be and how different it is now.
Totally. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
born in the 80s, and yeah, absolutely. That was the and
Hmm.
that's the other interesting thing right now in, autism advocacy and research is that a lot of things are assumed to be a part of autism, like alexithymia, having a low emotional awareness and, kind of like low emotional experience,
Hmm.
like not having as many emotions and having trouble, like, relating to them or understanding what they are.
Hmm.
A lot of autistic people have alexithymia, and the ones that don't have alexithymia, like me, like I had trouble connecting with my body, but for different reasons, for more like trauma reasons.
Mm.
And I don't have alexithymia, and so it was a lot harder for people to recognize my autism because they were like, "But
Yeah.
you have emotional awareness."
Yeah.
So again, it's just and I think, coming
Yeah.
back to like the gender labels and stuff, same thing, right? If people have met, say, two people with this particular label and set of pronouns, we are, as human creatures, it's our brain's natural thing to like put things into categories and try to explain them and create these schemas just as shorthand so that we don't have to think through every single thing every time, right?
Hmm.
The brain wants things to be easy and understandable and categorized. And the one I saw the other day that was so funny was like, if you give humans, I love that if you give humans a box that says odd and a box that says even, and then all the letters of the alphabet, they will try to sort those letters into odd and even though that doesn't make sense. Like
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that's just our,
Interesting.
our brain's natural thing to make things easier on ourselves is to
Hmm.
categorize.
Yeah. That's so interesting, because I can relate to a lot of things. Like, sometimes when you look at the characteristics, I suppose, I'm not going to call it symptoms, because it's not, I don't consider it like a disorder. It's just variety, it's diversity. It's a variation in my book. So yeah, I can relate to characteristics of like autism, ADHD, OCD. OCD especially, I think that's definitely something that is a thing in my life, and that's showed up. And then recently I read about OCD can be showing up as a masking technique, or masking
Yep.
a way of masking ADHD. And I was like, oh gosh. And I know so many people with ADHD, and like people left, right, and center around me, like, I'm getting diagnosis. I've just been diagnosed. I think I have, ADHD or whatever. And I'm like, it makes me wonder. But also, like I said, that there's things that I can relate to very much, and there's other things that I can't relate to at all. That might be characteristics of ADHD.
Hmm.
So I think we're just all so diverse, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of ADHD, anyway, one of the labels you gave me was AuDHD. So can you talk a bit about that and how that relates to you?
Yeah, so that's the combined autism and ADHD neurotype. And I like it as a combined neurotype. Like, I like the term because they're both, developmental, your whole life, these, things existing in the brain. Again, the brain develops differently. So my brain is different. But part of what I noticed is that as a combined neurotype, it's so interesting and unique. And one of the, just sort of like questions I'll ask people if they're thinking about whether that applies to them is, does it feel like almost no advice ever works for you? And it's because even sort of neurodivergent advice is usually for one neurotype. So, like, autistic advice might be, oh, you're having a problem with this thing. Well, go make a routine, like,
Yeah.
form a routine around it because that'll feel good for you. And then the ADHD advice will be, for the same problem, will be, don't try to tie yourself down, like, just let it be flexible and loose. Well, my system wants both of those things
Yeah.
desperately.
Yeah, it's so conflicting, right? How do you
Yeah.
manage that? And like some people who are close to me with ADHD are like, they're just continuously struggling with this stuff. I just
Yeah.
see it all the time. Yeah.
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 So I actually have a new podcast called AuDHD Flourishing. That's, I think, 6 or 7 episodes in.
Nice. I'll
Yeah.
check it out. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm getting such a response to it. Like I've been getting messages almost every day from people who are listening to it and saying like, this is the first time I felt like I understood my own experience, or like someone else understood my experience. Cause I'm talking about that conflict. It's almost like I almost think of having an ADHD part and an autistic part within me,
Mm-hmm.
even though, again, they are, throughout my experience, but
Yeah.
sometimes it really feels like they're fighting each other.
Yeah.
That one of them like wants a morning routine and one of them is like, good luck trying to keep a routine past 6 weeks.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Gosh. That's so great. You like your podcast, I mean, because it can be so tricky. I'm definitely going to give it a listen. Your other podcast, remind me what the name of that is?
The Longer Road.
The Longer Road. Yeah.
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 So that one, the intention behind that is that a lot of people with multiple identities that are often marginalized
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times feel behind in life
Mm.
because, like for example, in my case, I was spending a lot of my 20s dealing with health issues. And so, by the time I kind of came around to feeling like my career was coming together in my 30s, a lot of my friends were already, what I perceived to be way past me, sort of in
Mm.
development in their life. And so the podcast is just for people with those, multiple intersectional identities who
Mm-hmm.
want to hear what I was actually looking for a podcast like this and not finding it, because there are
Yeah.
lots of podcasts on disability and race and gender, right? Like these different
Yeah.
kind of topics. But what
Yeah.
I was particularly interested in is, okay, I want to hear somebody who has like 4 or 5 of the same identities as me talking about what worked for them
Mm-hmm.
and their specific experience. So when I have guests, like that's kind of the focus, is like what's your like real experience of being alive right now,
Mm.
and like
Yeah.
what's worked for you.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I'm just thinking about the other labels that you
Mm-hmm.
gave me. Like queer is right at the end, but I was thinking, does that relate for you to gender or sexuality or both or more? What is that
Both.
about?
Yeah. And actually, a term I did not put in there, but that I also love is neuroqueer
Yes.
as a term. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
love that, as a really, again, it's an expansive
Mm-hmm.
label.
Yeah.
So a lot of labels feel like, okay, we're narrowing down, we're finding that little tiny slice that describes me well, or is the closest to describing my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And neuroqueer feels very expansive. And same with queer. I think queer feels
Yeah.
expansive to me. It's just like,
To
you
me
know
too.
what?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever.
Just
Like I'm
queer.
queer, you're queer.
Simple.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And that, especially I think from the gender perspective, means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm.
Weirdly enough, one of the groups of people that has misgendered me the most is cis gay men.
Interesting.
Like I've noticed
Mm.
when I'm in gay spaces that I get misgendered way more than in any other space. And
Mm.
not just people being like, girl, which is the thing.
Yeah.
I don't mean that. I mean like people specifically, calling me she.
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
and like and it's this, it's because they are cis gay men who are only interested in cis gay men. And so
Yeah. I
because
wonder
I
if it's,
don't
yeah,
have a penis, they're just like,
exactly.
no.
Like they have a
Yeah.
certain
Yeah.
idea and perspective about masculinity, I suppose,
Right.
and it's like you're too, in their perspective, maybe you're too far removed from that to be considered, you know, masculine enough to
Yeah.
be an, I don't know.
And
It's
there
just,
are gay cis men who are totally down with trans men,
yeah,
but I am not that, and I'm not necessarily trying to present that. I'm not
yeah.
performing masculinity at like a high level. I'm not
Hmm.
performing
Hmm.
femininity either. I'm just kind of existing. That's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
they see that and they're just like, oh, you're not performing masculinity enough to be one of us.
Exactly. Yeah,
You're not a gay guy. And
yeah,
it's, yeah. So anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
That makes sense. Obviously, you don't want to generalize because not all cis gay
Of
men are
course,
like
not
that.
all cis gay men.
Not
Yeah.
all cis
Hashtag.
hashtag. Not all cis gay men. Okay, yeah, totally. So, yeah, relationship anarchy and poly. Shall we touch on that before we
Yeah.
wrap up a conversation?
Yeah. So in that same period of time when I was trying to figure out my sexuality, in my
Yeah.
teens and college, I realized when I was in the first sexual relationship that I had, which was in college, I was just like, this is not working. Like, I think we should see other people. I didn't know what poly was. I didn't have the label,
Mm.
but I sort of like independently thought of this idea and was like, I don't know if anybody does this, but like, this seems like a good idea. My boyfriend
Mm.
at the time we tried it a little bit and then he hated it. And he's, straight and cis and monogamous now. Although he questioned everything while he was with me, which I thought was charming. He was just like,
Nice.
what's happening?
Yeah.
Which is lovely. I think, think
Yeah.
about your gender, think about your sexuality. And
Totally.
then if
Get
you
curious.
are straight and cis, that's totally fine. But at least
Yeah.
you've thought about it.
Yeah.
And he did that. He went through that process. But yeah, then I found, what poly was, polyamory as a term and community. And then relationship anarchy for me is a relatively newer term. I think I learned that probably in the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
But basically that is, or maybe a little longer, but yeah, it's within the last decade for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically not categorizing and prioritizing relationships based on your sexual connection. So even if you're poly, a lot of people are hierarchical poly. It's
Yeah.
like you have a, primary
Primary,
partner.
yeah.
And yeah, that's like a term people
Mm-hmm.
use. And even people who aren't doing hierarchical, like I have a nesting partner, right? We live together. We own a house together. That's going to be a real pain in the ass if we break up. One of us can't just like walk away, right?
Yeah.
So we have like an actual legal thing in place that would make it hard for us to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
If we ever got married, that is a thing that other people prioritize. And I've noticed that in like poly circles, that if a couple is married, people do default to prioritizing that relationship.
Yeah.
Even if they're trying not to.
Mm-hmm.
So relationship anarchy for me is, my friends are just as important as my partners. My family is as important, right? Like I have all these, there are people who I'm close with, who I care about, who I would drop everything for. And it's not just my nesting partner.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other kind of thing that we explicitly talk about a lot is, the shape of our relationship could change. The shape of our connection could change. If one of us, one of the examples we've brought up is like if one of us has a partner with a kid, and if we want to put a lot of effort into that relationship, or if they want to live with us, right? Like that would obviously change, or like if one of us decided to have a kid actively with someone else, right? Like that's like the kind of thing that is allowed and that we are open to, and but we're not like necessarily actively pursuing. So it's sort of, in my mind, a lot of relationship anarchy is just sort of like whatever happens, and I'm here for it, and we're going to figure it out. As opposed to, I think some of the way people do poly is like, I want to have certain types of relationships, or like want to have certain relationships meet certain of my needs, and I'm looking for that actively. So I'm trying to like fill a spot. Almost like a work placement. Looking for someone who could do these things for me. And I'm just kind of like, yeah, whatever. I find people, I let the relationship take its natural shape, kind of however much space it wants to take up.
That's interesting, because I think initially when I started exploring polyamory for myself, I feel like it's been in the back of my head for quite a while, and it's something that maybe part of me, as I wouldn't say always, because what does that even mean? But like for a long time, I've been like, I wonder. And then I think it just became more and more sort of prominent. And then I think initially I was in that place as well, like, oh, needs, that's a thing. And I have to figure this out. Also clueless, recovering people pleaser, no idea what my needs are, so having to figure that out. #therapy. So yeah, just trying to navigate this field of polyamory. And I think I was in a place, a very brain-based, maybe rational place of like, right, needs, I have these needs, and this person can meet those needs, and those people can meet those needs. And how does that work together? But I feel like I've also moved into a place of like, I'm not actively looking for stuff, because to be honest, I can't be bothered. I'm just in a place of like,
that's so real.
Right? Yeah. Because I'm more in a place now where I'm like, I just want to have the freedom to connect with people in any way that feels good, without restrictions or limitations. And it feels really simple. And that allows for a certain amount of fluidity. Like when something happens, then you can talk about it with your other partner or partners, and then you navigate things from there. You figure things out. And is that hard? Yes, it is. But it's also hard to fit into this monogamous space if that's just not for you and it doesn't work for you. I feel like monogamy is great, but it's just one relationship style that we should choose consciously rather than be assigned it and be like, this is how you do relationships and anything else is not okay.
Totally. And I think that actually relates very directly back to gender and sexuality for me, because I think of monogamy like I think of straightness. I'm like, I'm sure there are some people who are naturally monogamous, and I'm sure there are some people who are naturally straight, but it's not the majority of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Is there anything you would like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
I think, I mean, something I've been thinking about a lot lately with the labels and, the work I'm putting out there around neurodivergence
Mm-hmm.
and, talking about my own experiences and all this stuff is that especially being autistic and in particular having that, I needed to hear that the label existed before I could figure out what was happening
Yeah.
for my experience. And so if you feel like you're different and your experiences are just not mapping onto the labels that you're using, if you're like, these labels just aren't making sense for me, just keep looking because people have come up with so many terms. I
Yeah.
was going to say, look at Tumblr. I know Tumblr's not as active as it used to be, but like literally I've learned so many new terms from Tumblr specifically,
Mm.
but just like social media in general, right? Like if you are finding people who are close enough to your experience or the labels you're using or the labels you're considering using, and then just kind of keep digging and kind of just keep
Mm.
following that rabbit hole because I guarantee you somebody has described your experience somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
even if it feels like you're the only one and there's nothing that could possibly describe you, right?
Yeah.
So you will find it. And that's what, again, what I'm finding with the AuDHD Flourishing podcast is people are saying things like, I've never heard anybody put it exactly this way,
Mm-hmm.
so that exists out there for whatever you're looking for. And then when you find that, then you get to start playing with the labels. And once you've kind of found, and again, it's not that the labels are the most important thing. It's just finding people who have a similar experience to you
It's that
because
resonance,
it
isn't it?
means
It's
a
like a
lot.
light
Yeah.
comes on, I think. Like
Yep.
ding, and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And usually what happens with that too is that people are mentioning things and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was part of this,
Mm-hmm.
this
Yeah.
other little corner of my life that I'd never considered being
Yeah.
part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Amazing. Lovely. Oh, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yay. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Mattia, where you can also read the transcript, and you can find Mattia on their website, mattiamaurée.com, and on Linktree at MattiaM. Links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media and on YouTube. Again, if you appreciate this podcast and want to support us, visit our website to make a donation, find out more about our allyship course and workshops, and details of how to join our community. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.